Hey everybody, I'm the Drink Pro. Today we've got two different products from Heaven's Door. What's up everybody, Kyle the Drink Pro here with you yet again. Thank you as always for tuning in. Please consider clicking subscribe and the little bell for notifications. It helps me out immensely. I've got two different pours today from a little non-distilling producer, not that little, called Heaven's Door. I've got a 10-year-old bourbon and something that they call their Highway 61 blend. Now Heaven's Door is actually a joint venture between Spirit Investments Partnership and Bob Dylan. It's in fact the only kind of partnership like this that Bob Dylan has done. He doesn't usually do endorsements for products and he doesn't usually do joint ventures. So this is a very unique thing for Bob Dylan. And a lot of the art and the music that is made Bob Dylan famous is incorporated into the bottlings and the branding of Heaven's Door. But I want to talk about the whiskey specifically today because I think there's a lot of trepidation when people see a famous person of any kind, a celebrity, a sports figure, or a musician trying to sell some sort of whiskey product or a spirit in general. That is something that can rub people the wrong way because they see it as a money grab and not as something that's being done for the quality of the product. So we will find out today if the Heaven's Door blends are quality or not. Both of the whiskeys I have today are created using the Lincoln County process. They are Tennessee bourbons. If you don't know about the Lincoln County process, it's essentially a charcoal filtration process, but I go into that in more detail in other videos. Specifically, I remember talking about it in my Uncle Nearest video. Click it, click it, click it, click it, click it, click it. But other than that, they are pretty short on detail about what exactly goes into these products. I know it's undisclosed Tennessee bourbon, and that's kind of it. I have heard that it's probably not Dickel based on the flavor profile. And I've also heard some discussions from the master blender who talks about where they pull these barrels from, but that's not hard and fast information. That's only reliable for the time he was talking about because, you know, that interview I read was several years ago. So who knows whether or not he's still picking from those locations or not. Unlike somebody that's big and established like a brand of Blanton's from Buffalo Trace where they are pretty explicit about where they're pulling those barrels so that you know it's going to be a consistent product, or at least that's the theory. The other sample I have is this Highway 61 blend. Shout out to Keith Jones for providing me with this sample. And it's actually a blend of three different bourbons and two different ryes that individual stores or private selection clubs can put together themselves and then decide the percentage of each barrel that goes into the final blend. I think that's a really cool thing that Heaven's Door is allowing these people to do. Now we know again that the bourbon is coming from an undisclosed Tennessee distillery. I've heard a rumor that the ryes they're using for this blend, because it's 3 bourbons and 2 ryes, that the ryes are coming from MGP, but I could not confirm that. This particular blend is at 93.6 proof, so it's slightly lower than the 100 proof Heaven's Door 10-year. So I'm actually going to start with this, even though it's kind of a more unique one-off product, because it is a store pick and it's a blend. Maybe it's just psychosomatic, but as soon as I smell this thing, I definitely smell Dickel juice. They say that it's not Dickel. Well, the master distillers don't say. Other reviewers have said that it's not Dickel, but it's definitely got that sort of sickly sweet fruit minerality quality that people often cite from Dickel. But on this, it's a relatively background note, and I think part of that is because this is blended in some ryes as well. You definitely get some baking spice on the nose. It's pretty sharp too. If it's cinnamon, it's like a Red Hots cinnamon. And you get this nice, sweet, I guess I would say it's like brown sugar, like a light brown sugar. It's very baked bread vibes on the nose. But the more I keep smelling it, the more the rye comes out to play. The herbal notes become more and more prominent, and the sweetness kind of transitions from this sort of sweet baked bread quality, like a dessert bread, into almost like a fresh citrus fruit. It's kind of funny to me, it actually keeps bouncing back and forth between these experiences. It's almost like the bourbon and the rye haven't been able to blend together, even though they're put in the same glass. I get this very classic bready bourbon experience, and then it bounces into this citrus herbal rye experience, and back and forth and back and forth. They don't enmesh themselves. They are very separated. And again, I want to emphasize that this is a one-off blend. This is something that an individual group or a store has done, and then they could select the percentages and they could select the barrels. So your results will definitely vary on the Highway 61 editions. After several minutes of just sitting here silently nosing this, there's starting to be some really unique notes that I'm picking up again and again. You're definitely getting this kind of minty quality, but I'm also getting what I would consider to be tangerine. It's definitely that orangey citrus fruit, but it's a little bit sharper than a classic navel orange, for example. And the earthiness on this is very particular. I'm getting sort of like dirt and parsley or something. It's a very specific and not particularly strong herbal component in the nose that I'm liking, but that I don't get very often. That's really interesting. So my initial impressions of this are good. I haven't had anything else to drink today, so I'm coming into this with a fresh palate, but that also means a more sensitive palate. With something that's under 100 proof, it can actually be a real advantage. If you have several drinks beforehand, you try to review a 90 proof whiskey, you're going to be desensitized to a lot of the components that are there. People talk about the problem with an alcohol burn of a higher proof whiskey. Well, you can have the opposite problem if you're used to that and then you go down in proof. But for me, it's got a really nice blend of sort of classic rye components and classic bourbon components. The Tennessee quality may just be in a mellowing, but I think my biggest concern is, on the first taste at least, it kind of feels like the blend collapsed. If you don't know what I'm talking about, people that are blending whiskeys often will have this problem where you want to sort of get this interesting mix of flavors, and what will end up happening is all of the flavors will sort of collapse on themselves, and you'll just get 2 or 3 main flavors, and the nuance falls away. Let me keep tasting this though and see if that nuance starts to show up after a few drinks. That second taste I got even less than the first one. It still has some sweetness, but the rye becomes a lot more predominant. The mid palate is all spicy rye and grain, and a little bit of that sort of like bitter herbal quality. Almost like a licorice, but it doesn't have nearly as much of that sharp anisness. Anisness. All right, here we go, third taste. Yeah, I think this blend has unfortunately collapsed. That's sort of the bug and the feature of doing something like a Highway 61 blend, where you give a lot more control to the individual stores and the individual owners. So there's a lot of things going on in here, and unfortunately, in my opinion, they sort of collapse on themselves and you just get a nice bourbon flavor and then a nice rye mid-palate and finish. It's not bad, it's not a problem, but I bet you that if you blended this differently, there would be a lot more complexity in the pour. For me, this is an easy sipper. It's got a nice sweet up front component, and then the rye grain comes in pretty strong in the mid-palate, finishes with some sweetness and some black pepper, but also a definite rye grain still in a little bit of barrel spice. So it's pretty generic, I would say. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does tell me that there was probably complexity and nuance and subtlety that was lost through the blending process. That is going to happen when you have individual stores and individual clubs doing these blends, because it's hard to make a good blend. You ask somebody like the Carters that spend just an unbelievable amount of time blending their whiskey to get it just the way they want it, and they get a lot of nuance in it. That's something that comes from a lot of work and just honing in the blend perfectly. That's probably not something you have the chance to do when you're given these barrels from Heaven, I almost said Heaven Hill, from Heaven's Door and Highway 61 blending it together. I want to be clear though, I think the Highway 61 is a fun product mostly because it's a blend of bourbons and ryes. If you've never had a product that blended bourbon and rye together, this is a great place to go because it does it very well in the sense of being very classic bourbon flavors and very classic rye flavors and having them kind of a mesh. Much better than on the nose, the flavors get meshed together on the palate. But it doesn't blow me away. It's not extraordinary, which is kind of what I'm looking for when you're doing a blend like that, especially when I'm looking for store picks. I've become very discerning, maybe that's a kinder way to put it, when it comes to store picks, because so often I end up finding that I prefer the standard product, especially when the proof is the same. So you gotta find stores that you trust, you gotta find palates that you trust, and if they're the ones blending it and they know what they're doing, then you'll probably like it. Okay, but let's get into this 10-year Heaven's Door. Now this is all bourbon. Oh, it's very sweet on the nose. This gives me a ton of dark brown sugar, wet oak, almost a molasses. It almost has that bitter, dark, deep sweetness. I actually sort of get like pecan pie. I get this nuttiness as well, but it's routed in this big sweet flavor. This sort of also confirms for me that the rye in that blend was bringing that fruit component, which is what I expected, but this really confirms that this 10-year or maybe 11-year, who really knows, but at least 10-year-old bourbon has very little fruit. It's all nutty, oaky, and sugary sweet. Honestly, I feel like pecan pie really does it a lot of justice. It has this nice crust, pie crust kind of note. Definitely pecans, definitely very sweet, deep, sugary flavors. Flavors in the nose is a weird thing to talk about, but that's where my brain goes. And then I also get like a little bit of lemon zest, which people may not associate with pie, but if you've baked before, lemon zest can be a very powerful thing in small quantities, so very well could be part of a pecan pie if done a certain way. The more I keep smelling it, the more I get this creamy vanilla creme brulee component. The deep nutty oakiness kind of subsides and the sweetness becomes a little bit lighter and fluffier. Oh, and that lemon zest is starting to grow as well. It's becoming a lot more citrusy. I still think that orange fruit component I was getting in the Highway 61 was from the ryes and not the bourbons. But I'm definitely starting to get a lot more citrus, like zest component on this one. There's also a definite butterscotch component. It's very, very subtle, but it's there. And it's something that harkens back to a lot of the older, dusty bourbons. In my mind, those have a lot more butterscotch and sometimes toffee than a lot of modern bourbons. So it's kind of fun to find that note, even if it's very, very subtle. You know, thinking about the different spices I've named that kind of go into this blend, I really have to go with sort of like a Jamaican allspice. That, to me, is the predominant spice component. There's a little bit of cinnamon, a little bit of ginger, a little bit of nutmeg, a little bit of clove. There's a little bit of a lot of things, but the predominant note, if you haven't ever smelled it, allspice. That's what I'm getting on this pour. And it's maybe a strange accompaniment because there's so much of that sweetness that keeps coming back. Okay, let's go ahead and taste it. Now that is a classic bourbon flavor. It's oaky. It's got that 10 or 11 years on it for sure, but the oak isn't overpowering. It's got a really nice sweetness that's very subtle. Lincoln County process, man, it makes that subtlety show up more, in my opinion, and part of that's because of the filtering. I'm actually a little surprised how sweet this is. I guess I shouldn't be because I talked about how sweet the nose was, but this tastes really sweet, and oftentimes with something this old, I expect a lot more bitter, tannic oak, even at 100 proof. But for me, I get a really nice combination here of sweetness. I think it's like honey, and oak, and a hint of sort of lavender, a very subtle, component of this herbalness. It's a really nice whiskey. Ooh, and the more I keep drinking this, the more this nice berry note is coming out. I'm actually super impressed with this. Maybe it's because it was a Bob Dylan collaboration. I expected this to be bad, but not bad. I shouldn't say bad. I expected it to be uninteresting. But this is actually a really good example of nuance and subtlety and character in Tennessee bourbon specifically. People discount Tennessee bourbon, making a mess. People discount Tennessee bourbon right away because they think of Dickel and they think of these bad experiences they've often had with that minerality, that Flintstone vitamin note, but this shows you what else can be in Tennessee bourbon. It's not just Jack Daniels and George Dickel. There's other people making other things, and sometimes they can really be gems. And I gotta say, I'm really impressed with this. I've had several more sips now, and every time it comes back to this beautiful sweetness up front, into the mid palate you get a spice. Now sometimes there'll be also a berry component along with it, but definitely either some kind of herbalness or some kind of barrel spice or maybe even a nuttiness. It's a wonderful sort of journey it takes you on, and then it finishes almost always with a sweet oak that's not overpowering, a black pepper that's not overpowering, and sort of this lingering nuttiness. It tastes very much like the pecan pie I mentioned earlier. That really sticks around, and oftentimes I expect to smell that and not taste it. So the fact that I'm tasting it here really stands out. But here's the problem. This is, I believe, a $130 bottle. Yeek. I don't think I can recommend this at that price point. I probably 6 months ago would have been a lot more likely to recommend this and say it's worth $130, but I have become much more frugal in the last couple of months, probably because I'm trying to buy a house. But thinking about what I can get for $70, $80, I can get some really fantastic whiskeys at that price point. Under $100, you can get a wonderful, wonderful pour. And is this better? Maybe. it's probably makes sense in terms of the cost and the profile, but I don't think it's enough better. I don't think the amount of quality increase from this versus a $100 barrel private release or some of the really wonderful Russell's Reserve picks that are out there, I don't think this makes sense at twice the price of a Russell's Reserve pick. It just doesn't. It's very good. Maybe a different example. It doesn't make sense at twice the price of a Jack Daniel's single barrel proof that you could then proof down to 100 proof. It doesn't really make sense to jump for this, at twice the price or more. Maybe 1.5 times as good. Now, if you've got money to spend, I would get it. Absolutely, it's worth it. But you've got to think about your frugality here. At least I am. So I'm going to keep drinking this sample. Thanks so much to Joe Brown and Keith Jones for providing these awesome samples. You all keep drinking like professionals. Cheers.